Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a journey so long and winding that it might just put your mind at ease. Picture yourself in an ancient marketplace, somewhere in the dusty heart of Asia, where fragrant oils and exotic spices filled the air. You're not just any traveller, but part of a caravan that's about to set off across the vast and mysterious Silk Road. The air around you is thick with the scent of sandalwood and frankincense, and the sky above is vast and endless. The heat of the desert sun bears down, but it's the promise of riches and adventure that fuels your journey. You probably won't survive this if you can't handle weeks of desert heat, treacherous mountain passes and the occasional bandit raid. But hey, no pressure. Just keep your wits about you and enjoy the ride, because this is no ordinary trade route. It's a path of discovery, connection, and of course, the exchange of some of the most coveted items in history. And we're not just talking about any old goods. No, we're talking perfume and spices. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a step back and explore how this entire trade network came to be. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, why not let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there? I'm curious to know what time of day or night you're joining me on this journey. I mean, isn't that part of the fun of trading stories and histories, bringing us all together no matter the distance? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Silk Road wasn't just one road, but a sprawling network of trade routes that stretched from the heart of China all the way to Europe and beyond. But what made it so unique? The Silk Road was born out of necessity. Merchants needed a way to transport goods over long distances, and this network of roads, mountains and deserts was the lifeblood of the ancient world. The road wasn't just a physical space, it was a bridge between cultures, ideas, and civilizations. At its heart, the Silk Road was driven by two things: the pursuit of wealth and the desire for knowledge. But among the most sought-after goods of the time were perfume and spices, each of which had its own story, its own allure, and its own place in history. Perfume in particular wasn't just something people wore for vanity, it was a symbol of status, luxury, and power. To be in possession of a rare fragrance distilled from the finest flowers, oils and resins was to hold a treasure. Perfume played an essential role in both personal grooming and spiritual rituals. Incense and perfumes were used in temples to honour the gods, and they were also believed to ward off evil spirits. For the wealthy, perfume became a commodity just as valuable as gold or silk. As early as the Han Dynasty, the Chinese were known to send fragrant oils along the Silk Road, not just for their aesthetic appeal, but as gifts for royalty in the West. It was a way to show respect and also to secure trade deals. These early perfumed oils were a mixture of local flowers and herbs, sometimes combined with spices, creating scents that were exotic to foreign lands. As you can imagine, the demand for such luxurious items exploded. But perfume wasn't the only commodity making its way along these ancient trade routes. Spices too became a driving force behind the expansion of the Silk Road. Spices, particularly those used in cooking and medicine, were highly prized by every culture that encountered them. They were so valuable that they became the equivalent of currency. In fact, many spices were traded more like gold than the ingredients we sprinkle casually on our food today. It wasn't just about flavour, it was about health, preservation, and status. Historians still argue about the exact origins of the Silk Road, with some claiming that it began as early as the 2nd century BCE, while others suggest it was a more gradual process. Regardless of the specifics, it's clear that by the 1st century CE, the trade routes were well established. Merchants from the east carried silk, spices and other goods to the west, while those from the west brought back items like glassware, textiles and of course, perfume. The idea that something as intangible as fragrance could cross continents and be so highly sought after is a testament to the power of scent. Perfume and spices weren't just luxury items for the wealthy elite though, they were also important in everyday life. In ancient Egypt, for example, perfume was a part of daily rituals for both the living and the dead. Fragrances were used in embalming to preserve bodies for the afterlife. In the Roman Empire, spices were used not only to flavour food but also for medicinal purposes. The idea that these seemingly simple items could be so intricately tied to culture, medicine, and even religion gives you an idea of how profound their trade was. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. After all, we've only just begun our journey. You might be wondering, What was it really like to be a merchant travelling along the Silk Road, carrying precious goods like perfume and spices? Imagine the vast distances they covered, the dangers they faced, and the cultures they encountered. It was not just about trading goods. It was about navigating a complex world of diplomacy, alliances, and rivalries. The merchants of the Silk Road were not just traders. They were negotiators, diplomats, and adventurers. They knew that in order to succeed, they had to understand the intricacies of each culture they encountered. Whether it was the Persians, the Romans, or the Chinese, each had their own customs, values, and ways of doing business. And when perfume and spices came into the picture, it wasn't just a matter of handing over a bag of goods. It was about establishing trust, sharing knowledge, and sometimes even offering up rare commodities as gifts to strengthen relationships. Let's pause here for a moment and think about the significance of these trade routes. The Silk Road wasn't just about commerce, it was about the exchange of ideas, beliefs, and knowledge. Merchants didn't just bring spices and perfumes, they also carried stories, religions, and technologies across the continents. It was through the Silk Road that we see the spread of Buddhism from India to China, the transmission of paper-making technology from China to the West, and the development of new forms of art and science. Historians have long debated the role of the Silk Road in shaping the world as we know it today. Some argue that it was the first truly global trade network, while others suggest that it was just one of many paths through which cultures interacted. Whatever the case may be, there's no denying that the trade in perfumes and spices played a crucial role in the formation of these global connections. And as we'll see in the coming sections, it wasn't just about the goods, it was about the human connections that made this incredible exchange possible. The Silk Road may have begun with humble beginnings, but it quickly grew into something far more significant. And tonight, we'll continue to explore how perfume and spices became the driving force behind this ancient network of trade, culture, and diplomacy. So sit back, relax, and let the journey unfold, one fragrant step at a time. Now that you're settled, let's keep that caravan moving. Remember, we're not just passing through the desert here. This is a journey filled with intrigue, danger, and of course, trade. As we continue along the Silk Road, imagine the sound of camel hooves crunching against the dry earth, the rhythmic jingle of the caravan bells, and the occasional chatter of merchants negotiating prices. It's hot, it's dusty, and the landscape stretches out endlessly in front of you. But what you're carrying, what everyone in your caravan is hauling, is worth all the discomfort. Perfume and spices are what everyone's after, and you're not the only one on this path. Other merchants, far more seasoned than you, are also bringing their precious goods to market, hoping to strike deals and make their fortunes. But there's something about perfume that makes it so special, and it's not just the scent. You see, the demand for perfume wasn't just about vanity, it was about status. The most fragrant oils, mixed from rare flowers and exotic herbs, were symbols of wealth, beauty, and spiritual favour. It's like wearing a luxury brand, but with a much longer-lasting effect. In the Roman Empire, for example, perfume was a key part of social rituals, often used to anoint the body and in religious ceremonies. But it wasn't just the Romans who had a fascination with scent. Civilizations across the Middle East and India were also keen on the power of perfume. From the most powerful emperors to the lowliest of priests, fragrance was an essential part of life. Perfume's allure lay not just in its fragrance, but also in its association with luxury and exclusivity. The rarer the scent, the more valuable it became. Some perfumes were made from flowers that only bloomed once a year, making them incredibly difficult and expensive to harvest. Others were created from resins or oils that had to be carefully extracted from plants that were either incredibly rare or could only be found in specific regions. As a result, these exotic scents could only be afforded by the rich and powerful. And who were they trying to impress? Other rich and powerful people, of course. Historians still argue whether perfume's primary role was to elevate personal status or to serve as a diplomatic tool. There's evidence to suggest that perfume played an important part in diplomacy. Emperors and kings often exchanged precious scents as gifts, a gesture that carried with it both symbolic and practical significance. These gifts were not just a sign of friendship, they were also a way of creating alliances, of securing trade routes, and sometimes even forging empires. It's hard to imagine something as intangible as fragrance having such a powerful role in the politics of the ancient world, but that's exactly what happened. Perfume wasn't just about the fragrance, though. It was an economic commodity that helped shape the global trade system much like spices. Spices, which are now a common part of almost every cuisine, were once as valuable as gold. Cinnamon, cloves, pepper, and saffron were just a few of the spices that could make a merchant's fortune. And much like perfume, the desire for spices wasn't just about flavouring food, it was about preserving food, about health, and about luxury. But let's pause for a moment and think about this. How did these goods make their way from one corner of the world to the other? We're talking about routes that spanned thousands of miles, traversing some of the most difficult terrains on Earth. It wasn't just about crossing a couple of mountain ranges, it was about navigating vast deserts, perilous river crossings, and negotiating with people whose languages you couldn't even understand. And yet, despite these obstacles, merchants were willing to take these risks for one thing: profit. That's where the merchants of the Silk Road came in. Unlike the image of the lone adventurer that we sometimes see in stories, the Silk Road merchants were part of a highly organized system of trade. They weren't just taking goods from one place to another, they were skilled negotiators, diplomats, and even spies. When you're transporting precious cargo like perfume and spices, you can't just trust anyone to handle it. These merchants had to know the ins and outs of every culture, every market, and every customer they encountered. They had to understand not just the prices of goods, but also the political landscape of the regions they passed through. These merchants didn't just travel for the love of adventure. No, they travelled for money, for influence, and for the status that came with bringing exotic goods to distant lands. The farther they travelled, the more valuable their goods became. And it wasn't just about the rare flowers or the spices, they were transporting something even more precious: knowledge. Along the Silk Road, ideas flowed as freely as commodities. Buddhism made its way from India to China, and the knowledge of papermaking spread from China to the West. The exchange of ideas was just as important as the exchange of goods. Historians still argue whether the real treasure of the Silk Road was the goods it carried or the ideas it transmitted. The tangible goods, like perfume and spices, certainly had their value, but the knowledge, culture, and religion that travelled along with them were arguably just as important. The Silk Road was more than just a trade route. It was the world's first global network of exchange, a conduit through which cultures met, clashed, and blended in ways that would shape the world forever. But let's not forget the role of the environments these merchants crossed. Picture the vast deserts of Central Asia, where the heat of the day is unbearable and the cold of the night can freeze you to the bone. Think about the mountains that rise up out of nowhere, their peaks covered in snow, and the forests that seem to stretch on forever. The Silk Road wasn't just a highway, it was a challenge, and it was filled with dangers, both natural and human. Bandits lurked along many of the routes, eager to steal anything of value, including the precious goods the merchants carried. And yet, despite the hardships, the merchants kept moving forward, driven by the promise of wealth, adventure, and the thrill of making history. The perfume, the spices, and the precious cargo they carried were just the beginning. What truly made the Silk Road remarkable was its ability to bring together people from all corners of the world, cultures that had never before encountered each other, now sharing goods, ideas, and stories. These stories, passed along the route, would eventually create a network of relationships that spanned continents, forging connections that would last for centuries. As we continue our journey, we'll dive deeper into how perfume and spices came to define this ancient trade route. The path isn't just a straight line, it's filled with twists, turns, and unexpected encounters that make it all the more fascinating. So let's keep moving, because the next leg of our journey will take us into the heart of trade itself. Now, as the caravan continues on, we find ourselves in Central Asia, the heart of the Silk Road. If you've ever imagined an ancient crossroads, a place where the East meets the West, this is it. Picture vast steppes stretching out in all directions, the horizon dotted with tiny oases, where traders stop to rest and replenish their goods. It's here in Central Asia that the essence of the Silk Road truly takes form. The heat is oppressive during the day, but as night falls, the temperature plummets, and the stars fill the sky, seemingly endless. You're walking along a path that, for centuries, has been the meeting ground for traders from across the world. The significance of Central Asia in the Silk Road trade can't be overstated. It wasn't just a place where goods passed through, it was a hub of culture, language, and innovation. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv weren't just trading posts, they were thriving centres of learning, art, and commerce. For the merchants travelling through these cities, it wasn't just about exchanging perfume or spices, it was also about encountering new ideas, technologies and philosophies. This is where East meets West in a way that changed the world. But why did Central Asia play such a pivotal role? Part of it comes down to geography. This region was situated in the middle of the vast landmass, strategically positioned to connect China with the Mediterranean world. It was the natural bridge for the flow of goods between the East and the West. But more than just a crossroads for goods, it was also a melting pot for cultures. The nomadic tribes of the steppes, with their mastery of horse riding, were the perfect protectors and guides for the caravans travelling across this vast region. Historians still argue whether Central Asia was the true birthplace of the Silk Road, or whether it was the result of the convergence of multiple trade routes over time. Some suggest that the trade routes existed long before the Silk Road became an established network, but it wasn't until the 2nd century BCE, during the Han Dynasty in China, that the Silk Road as we know it began to take shape. Whether it was one grand plan or a more organic development, what's clear is that the heart of the trade, and the diffusion of both goods and ideas, was in Central Asia. Merchants didn't just pass through these cities, they stayed for weeks, sometimes months, swapping stories, goods, and sometimes even spouses. Imagine the bustling markets, aromas of exotic spices filling the air, the sound of foreign languages overlapping, and the sight of traders from all over the known world bargaining over fine silks, rare perfumes, and spices. It wasn't just about material exchange, it was also about cultural exchange. The blending of different traditions, cuisines, and languages created a rich, diverse environment that shaped the region for centuries to come. And as much as the merchants brought goods to Central Asia, they also carried back with them stories. Stories of distant lands, of empires and kingdoms, of scientific discoveries and artistic innovations. Some merchants brought back manuscripts that detailed the discoveries of ancient Greece, while others carried news of China's early inventions like paper and printing, which would later spread to the West. These exchanges were just as valuable as the physical goods, and it's easy to see how the Silk Road became not just a trade route but a bridge between civilizations. But let's focus back on perfume and spices. In Central Asia, the demand for these goods was astronomical. The local elite, as well as visiting traders, craved the luxury of fine perfumes and the health benefits of spices. Perfume, as we discussed earlier, was a symbol of status, and it was in Central Asia that this idea really took off. The Persian Empire, which at its height controlled vast stretches of land between Central Asia and the Mediterranean, was especially fond of perfumes. It's believed that they cultivated their own special flowers and herbs for the purpose of creating fragrances, and this trade soon spread to their neighbours in India and beyond. Spices too found a home in Central Asia, and this is where the demand for them really began to grow. The region had a long history of using spices in cooking and medicine. The idea of combining spices for flavour, for preservation, and for health was nothing new to the peoples of Central Asia. But as trade routes expanded and new spices were introduced from the distant lands of India and Southeast Asia, the variety of spices grew exponentially. Saffron, cinnamon, pepper and cloves became highly sought-after commodities, and merchants began to understand just how lucrative this trade could be. Historians still debate how exactly spices made their way from Southeast Asia to Central Asia and beyond. Some argue that the spices were transported via sea routes, particularly through the Indian Ocean, while others suggest that overland routes through India played a more significant role. Regardless of the route, the impact of spices on the Silk Road is undeniable. Spices didn't just enrich the flavour of food, they had medicinal properties that were highly valued. Turmeric, for example, was prized not just as a cooking ingredient, but for its supposed ability to cure ailments like inflammation and digestive issues. Cinnamon and ginger were used to treat colds and digestive problems, while pepper was considered an aphrodisiac. And let's not forget the role of perfume in this trade. Perfume wasn't just a luxury item for the rich, it had medicinal properties too. The ancient Egyptians were some of the first to document the medicinal uses of fragrances. Frankincense and myrrh, for example, were used in ancient times for their antiseptic properties, and were even used in embalming. When the perfumes reached Central Asia, they weren't just used for beauty, they were used for healing and spiritual practices. Incense, often made from aromatic woods, was burned in temples and palaces, believed to carry prayers and offerings to the gods. It's no wonder that perfume and spices became such powerful commodities. The demand for them was driven by more than just luxury. They were part of a wider cultural fabric that included health, power, religion, and status. And in Central Asia, the cultural exchange of these goods reached its peak, with people from all over the world coming together to trade, barter, and sometimes even argue over the prices of these rare and coveted items. As you continue to follow the caravan across this vast region, you can't help but feel the sense of history that pulses through the air. You're part of something much larger than just a simple trade route. You're in the middle of a cultural crossroads, where ideas, goods, and people are constantly moving, shifting, and influencing one another. Central Asia isn't just a place on the map. It's the heart of the Silk Road, the point where East and West converge. And whether you're selling perfumes, spices, or stories, you can feel the weight of centuries of trade and culture in every step you take. Historians still argue whether the trade of perfume and spices in Central Asia truly changed the world, or whether it was the sheer volume of goods that made this region so important. Regardless of the answer, what's clear is that this region was the lifeblood of the Silk Road, the place where cultures collided and exchanged in ways that shaped history forever. As the caravan pushes further along the Silk Road, we begin to see the transformation of trade itself. Central Asia was only the beginning. Now, you find yourself passing through cities that are known the world over for their grandeur, wealth, and the exotic goods they host. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv are no longer just stops along the road. They are the beating heart of the Silk Road. The air smells sweet with the scent of spices, incense, and perfume wafting through the bustling marketplaces. Everywhere you look, merchants haggle over goods, their colourful silks and bright turbans creating a vivid contrast against the dusty backdrop of the trade route. But it's not just about the exchange of material wealth. It's here, in these cities, that the culture and influence of the Silk Road begin to take shape. The significance of these cities cannot be overstated. Samarkand, for example, was known as the Pearl of the East. This city, with its majestic blue-tiled domes and grand marketplaces, became a cultural and intellectual hub, a place where goods weren't the only thing being exchanged. Scholars, artists, and travellers from all corners of the world would come here, bringing with them not only luxury items like perfume and spices, but also knowledge, innovations, and philosophies. Imagine walking through the gates of Samarkand and hearing multiple languages spoken around you: Arabic, Persian, Turkic, and even the distant tongue of the Romans. These cities along the Silk Road were places where cultures blended, where ideas from the East and West mingled freely, giving birth to new concepts in science, art, and even politics. Historians still argue over whether cities like Samarkand and Bukhara were purely commercial centres, or whether they served as something more, a confluence of cultural exchange that propelled not only trade, but also the spread of knowledge. What is clear, however, is that these cities were places of immense power and influence, where perfume, spices, and other luxury goods became the currency of both trade and diplomacy. In these cities, perfume was more than just a commodity. It was a symbol of wealth and status. The wealthiest merchants and leaders would wear elaborate perfumes, often custom-made from exotic flowers and spices that marked their distinction from the common people. In these cities, the production of perfume was more than just a trade, it was an art. Skilled perfumers from places like Persia and Arabia would craft fragrances using the finest oils, resins, and spices, creating scents that could last for hours or even days. The art of perfumery was an essential part of the cultural fabric of these Silk Road cities, and as trade grew, so did the demand for these unique fragrances. The most expensive perfumes were made from the rarest ingredients: flowers that only bloomed for a short time, resins from trees that could only be found in distant lands, and spices that had been carefully harvested and prepared. These perfumes were often reserved for royalty or the very wealthy, but they were also given as diplomatic gifts, used to forge alliances and mark the significance of political relationships. Perfume's role as a status symbol wasn't just limited to the upper echelons of society. Even among the middle classes, the desire for fragrance was strong. In cities along the Silk Road, merchants and traders would often carry small vials of perfume with them, using the scent as a way to distinguish themselves in the bustling crowds of the marketplace. These small, portable containers became a hallmark of the Silk Road trade, representing both the luxury of the goods being traded and the influence of the merchant class itself. In a sense, carrying perfume was like carrying a piece of the Silk Road with you. a symbol of the vast network of trade routes that connected distant lands. Spices, on the other hand, were also at the centre of this trade. Just like perfume, spices were highly sought after and became an essential part of the Silk Road economy. The world's elite used spices not only for culinary purposes, but also for medicinal purposes. Saffron, cinnamon, ginger and pepper were just a few of the spices that carried immense value. They were believed to have health benefits, from curing digestive issues to providing relief from the common cold. Many people in the ancient world believed that spices had mystical or divine properties. Pepper in particular was regarded as so valuable that it was often used as currency itself. It was common for merchants to exchange large quantities of pepper for precious metals, goods, or even land. The trade in spices wasn't just about flavour, it was about prestige, status, and power. Historians still debate whether the trade of spices along the Silk Road was driven more by the desire for culinary innovation or by the quest for health and wellness. Some scholars believe that the medicinal benefits of spices were the primary motivation, while others argue that the appeal of new and exotic flavours was the driving force behind the demand for spices. Regardless of the reasoning, the impact of spices on the Silk Road trade cannot be denied. Spices were so important that they often dictated the course of trade itself, shaping the paths that merchants took and influencing the development of new trading cities and routes. The desire for these rare and precious spices created a web of commerce that stretched from the distant lands of Southeast Asia to the heart of Europe. As the caravan continues to move westward, you can feel the tension in the air. The further you travel, the more dangerous the journey becomes. The deserts are vast and unforgiving, and the mountains seem to stretch on forever. But despite the challenges, the promise of perfume and spices, along with the wealth they bring, keeps the merchants moving forward. The roads are fraught with dangers, but these goods are so valuable that they are worth the risk. It's not just about making a living, it's about participating in a system of trade and diplomacy that connects the world in ways that were unimaginable just a few centuries ago. As you move deeper into the heart of the Silk Road, it's clear that perfume and spices are more than just goods. They are symbols of the interconnectedness of humanity. They represent the meeting of cultures, the blending of ideas, and the way that trade can shape the course of history. The markets of these cities are teeming with people from all walks of life, but they are all connected by the same desire: the pursuit of wealth, the acquisition of rare goods, and the quest for prestige. In these bustling centres of trade, perfume and spices are not just items. They are lifeblood, they are currency, and they are the stories of the Silk Road itself. Historians still argue about the ultimate impact of the perfume and spice trade on the development of these cities. Were they simply outposts of commerce, or were they cultural hubs that played a much more significant role in the development of global civilizations? As we continue down this long and winding road, the answer might surprise you. But for now, we'll keep our focus on what made the trade itself so special. The goods that crossed continents, the lives they touched, and the empires they helped build. The further along the road we go, the more we realise that perfume and spices weren't just traded as goods. No, these substances had a much more profound impact on the people and places they touched. As we travel deeper into the Silk Road's influence, we begin to see just how these commodities, simple as they may seem, became entwined with the politics, religion, and even military strategies of the ancient world. The trade in perfume and spices wasn't just about making a profit, it was about power. Perfume, for instance, wasn't just a status symbol in the courts of the rich, it was a diplomatic tool. As the caravans pushed forward, so did the necessity for maintaining strong political ties. Imagine this: an emperor in Persia sends an ambassador to China, carrying with him a vial of the finest rose oil, a fragrance so delicate and rich that it could leave a lasting impression on anyone who smelled it. This wasn't just a gift, it was an offer of peace, a symbol of goodwill, and a very tangible representation of political allegiance. The same would happen in reverse, where Chinese emperors would send precious perfumes to their allies in Central Asia and beyond. The exchange of fragrance, much like the exchange of silk or gold, was a way of sealing agreements, forging bonds, and establishing trust. To offer a rare scent was not just to give a gift, it was to declare one's respect, and perhaps to ask for favours in return. Historians still argue whether the perfume trade was more important for its role in diplomacy or as a cultural expression of wealth and status. Some suggest that perfume's role in courtly rituals made it central to diplomacy, while others claim it was more a reflection of personal opulence. The truth, as often is the case, is somewhere in the middle. Perfume was both a tool of diplomacy and a statement of personal luxury. It showed that a person or a ruler had the means to access far-flung lands and the wealth to afford the rarest substances. In short, perfume made it clear who was in control. The ability to procure the most precious perfumes was a sign of a ruler's power, wealth, and reach. But it was also a delicate thing. Too much perfume, and you risked being seen as ostentatious or frivolous. So, there was a fine balance between restraint and excess that made perfume so powerful in the first place. Spices, on the other hand, were a more utilitarian commodity, but that didn't make them any less valuable. Far from it. Spices, with their medicinal, preservative, and culinary properties, became essential to the daily lives of people all across the Silk Road. You could find cinnamon, saffron, and ginger being used in everything from food to medicine. But spices weren't just for personal use, they also played an important role in warfare. Imagine you're an ancient general preparing for a campaign. What better way to ensure the health of your soldiers than by having a ready supply of ginger and garlic, two spices known for their ability to prevent sickness and boost energy? The trade in spices wasn't just a matter of luxury, it was a matter of life and death, and as you can imagine, military commanders knew this very well. Historians still debate the extent to which spices influenced military strategy along the Silk Road. Some claim that spices were crucial for keeping soldiers healthy during long campaigns, while others argue that the real driving force behind the spice trade was its role in food preservation. Either way, there's no denying that spices played a crucial role in the development of empires along the Silk Road. They weren't just for flavour, they were a lifeline. But beyond the battlefield and the courtly courts, perfume and spices played a more symbolic role in religious and spiritual practices. In the ancient world, scent was tied to the divine. The very act of burning incense or anointing oneself with fragrant oils was a ritual that connected the mortal with the divine. In India, for example, incense was burned in temples as a way of pleasing the gods. The same was true in ancient Egypt, where frankincense and myrrh were used to embalm the dead. And in the Greco-Roman world, perfume was often used in religious ceremonies, where it was believed to carry prayers and offerings to the gods. As we travel further down the Silk Road, we see how perfume and spices become not just commodities but sacred substances. The belief in their divine power only increased the demand for these items, as people came to believe that possessing these rare perfumes and spices brought them closer to the divine. Imagine a priest or a ruler anointing themselves with oils made from rare flowers, offering them as a way of connecting with the heavens. In some cultures, scent was believed to carry the essence of the divine, and the most precious perfumes were seen as a direct link to the gods. Spices, too, took on this aura of divine importance. In Hinduism and Buddhism, for example, spices were often used in rituals to cleanse the soul or to invite divine favour. So when perfume and spices made their way from one culture to the next, they weren't just changing hands, they were changing the very nature of spirituality itself. Historians still argue about the spiritual significance of these substances along the Silk Road. Was perfume merely a luxury item, or did it have deeper symbolic meaning? Did spices play a more important role in medicine, or were they truly sacred substances in their own right? The debate continues, but one thing is clear. The power of scent and flavour along the Silk Road was more than just a passing fad. It was a central part of the trade, culture and belief systems that connected the East to the West. As the caravan moves on, with the fragrances of exotic perfumes and the aroma of spices filling the air, you realise just how far-reaching this trade has become. What started as a simple trade route to transport silk and spices now encompasses a vast network of culture, power and spirituality. The Silk Road isn't just about commodities, it's about the transformation of entire civilizations, the exchange of ideas, and the development of networks that would shape history for centuries to come. Now, as we continue through this journey, remember that perfume and spices weren't just the treasures of the wealthy, they were the treasures of the world, and each of these precious goods carried with them the stories of the people who traded them, the civilizations that cradled them, and the empires that built their legacies upon them. As the caravan continues its slow march across the vast stretch of the Silk Road, the mountains ahead seem endless, and the path becomes increasingly treacherous. But despite the hardships, the promise of riches and adventure keeps the merchants moving forward. As we wind through these rough terrains, we also find ourselves entering the realm of the camel caravans, the lifeblood of the Silk Road. It's impossible to imagine this trade route without the iconic image of a caravan, camels laden with goods, trudging through endless deserts, across arid plains and up rocky mountain passes. The caravans were the real unsung heroes of the Silk Road. Without these steadfast animals and the people who guided them, the trade of perfume and spices, among other precious commodities, would have been nearly impossible. The camel, of course, was the perfect vehicle for this type of long-distance trade. Not only were camels capable of carrying large loads for long distances, but they were also incredibly well suited to the harsh environments they traversed. With their ability to go without water for days, their thick coats protecting them from both the intense desert heat and the cold mountain nights, camels were essential to the survival of those travelling along the Silk Road. Historians still debate the exact role camels played in the rise of the Silk Road. Some argue that camels were the reason for the expansion of the Silk Road in the first place, while others suggest that other forms of transportation, like horses or mules, were just as crucial. The general consensus, however, is that camels were, without a doubt, the primary method of transporting goods along these routes. But what was it really like to travel with one of these caravans? Imagine waking up before dawn, the cold desert air biting at your skin as you prepare for another long day of travel. The camels are already loaded with goods, perfume in small, fragile containers, sacks of spices like saffron and pepper, and bolts of fine silk that seem to shimmer even in the dim light. The sound of camel bells fills the air, a comforting jingle that marks the rhythm of the journey. The caravan leader, an experienced trader, calls out orders in a language that blends with the wind, while other traders prepare their own goods and make last-minute negotiations. The journey ahead will be long, and there are dangers along the way. Bandits, always a threat on the Silk Road, lurk in the mountains, hoping to ambush unsuspecting travellers. Yet it's not just human danger you'll face. The harsh environment is a constant adversary. The desert's blistering heat will drain you by day, and the freezing cold of the mountains will do the same by night. The sun is relentless, and yet the promise of trade, of perfume and spices making their way to distant lands, keeps the caravan moving forward. The life of a caravan merchant was difficult and dangerous, but it was also filled with reward. The goods they carried, fragrant perfumes, rare spices, silks, and other treasures, were more than just commodities. They were symbols of the caravan's ability to connect cultures, to bring together distant lands. It's not hard to imagine how these goods gained such legendary status. The farther you travelled, the more valuable they became. A vial of perfume from Persia could fetch an unimaginable price in the markets of Rome or Constantinople. Likewise, a sack of pepper from India or a bundle of saffron from the heart of Central Asia could be sold for a fortune in the bazaars of the Mediterranean. Historians still debate how much of the Silk Road's trade was driven by the sheer value of the goods, and how much was about the human element, the caravan routes, the merchants themselves, the very idea of connection across vast distances. Was the trade driven by the goods, or was it the promise of human relationships, the exchange of cultures, and the blending of distant lands? It's a question that historians have wrestled with for centuries, but one thing is for sure. The caravan, laden with perfume and spices, was central to this exchange. It's easy to overlook the mundane details of a caravan's daily life, but they were critical to the success of the trade. The care of the camels, the preparation of the goods, the navigation of the difficult terrain, all of these played a role in ensuring that perfume and spices made it to their destinations. Without the caravan routes, the Silk Road would have been a much less effective trade network, and without the steady progress of these caravans, the exchange of perfume and spices might never have reached the heights that it did. But there was more to these caravans than just the practical aspects of transport. There was a sense of camaraderie, of shared goals and mutual support. Life on the Silk Road wasn't easy, but it had its rewards. The merchants knew that with every step they were part of something far greater than just a trade route. They were part of an ongoing exchange of culture, ideas, and wealth. Perfume and spices were the materials of that exchange, but the caravan's role was to ensure that these goods could cross borders, spread new flavours, and perfume the world in ways that would have been unimaginable just a few centuries before. Imagine the sound of the caravan as it trudges through the desert, the camel's hooves marking the rhythm of the journey. The traders speak to one another in a dozen languages, swapping stories and experiences as they go. Every night, the caravan stops to camp, and the air fills with the aroma of spices cooking over the fire. It's not just about trading goods, it's about the people who make that trade happen, the hands that load and unload the precious perfumes, the voices that bargain over the price of saffron, and the lives that are intertwined in this vast network of exchange. Historians still argue whether the Silk Road could have succeeded without the development of these highly organized caravan systems. Some believe that without these structured caravanserais, large fortified inns where merchants could rest and regroup, the Silk Road would never have been as effective. Others suggest that the sheer volume of goods transported made these caravans a necessity. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. The caravan was essential to the success of the Silk Road. As we continue, the journey becomes both a literal and symbolic movement forward. We pass through the deserts and mountains, the camels laden with treasures from distant lands, and we begin to understand that the true power of the Silk Road wasn't just in the trade of the goods, it was in the human connections it forged, the bridges it built between cultures, and the lasting impact it had on the world. As the caravan moves along the well-trodden paths of the Silk Road, the further we journey, the more we see that the success of the perfume and spice trade wasn't just about the goods themselves. It was about how these goods influenced the very fabric of society. The Silk Road didn't just transport items, it transported ideas, cultures, and in many cases the very essence of what people believed about the world. The act of trading perfume and spices along this ancient route wasn't just about commerce. It was a pivotal force in the formation of societies and in how people viewed luxury, health, and even spirituality. Picture the bustling marketplaces that you now find yourself walking through, having arrived in one of the grand cities of the Silk Road. The air's thick with the scents of frankincense, myrrh, and the distinct aromas of cinnamon and cloves. Traders are offering their goods, many of which have come from places so distant that you can hardly imagine their origins. The perfume you smell is made of rare flowers, oils from faraway lands, and spices that have travelled through deserts and over mountains to reach this point. But what's fascinating isn't just that these items are rare, it's that these materials have come to represent something far greater than just their scent or flavour. Perfume, especially, has come to embody the cultures that crafted it. In the ancient world, perfume wasn't just something you wore or sprinkled on your body. It was something that defined social standing and reinforced power structures. When a ruler or nobleman adorned themselves with the finest perfumes, they weren't just enjoying a pleasant fragrance, they were signalling their dominance, their wealth, and their ability to control the exotic trade routes that brought these rare materials to their doorsteps. Historians still argue about the deeper meaning of perfume in ancient society. Was it simply a luxury item, or was it tied to deeper cultural and religious beliefs? Some suggest that perfume served a spiritual function. The use of incense and scented oils in religious rituals wasn't just a form of luxury, it was an offering to the gods, a way of connecting with the divine. This idea of scent as a bridge between the earthly and the divine helped elevate perfume beyond its use as a cosmetic. It became a symbol of a person's ability to elevate themselves, physically, spiritually, and socially. Similarly, spices weren't just for culinary purposes or even for medicine. They played a role in ancient religious and spiritual practices. Spices were used in offerings, in healing ceremonies, and as a way to purify both the body and the soul. The act of using rare and exotic spices in religious ceremonies could transform the mundane into the sacred. The smell of cinnamon or frankincense wasn't just a fragrant pleasure, it was a way of inviting the divine into one's life. As we look at the impact of these goods, it becomes clear that perfume and spices weren't merely luxuries for the rich. They were commodities that tied people to something greater than themselves. They represented a connection to the far-off lands they came from, to the gods, and to a sense of power that extended far beyond the individual. And in the marketplaces of the Silk Road cities, where perfume bottles glistened under the sun and spices were piled high in colourful mounds, this power became tangible. You could smell it in the air, feel it in the bustle of the trade, and see it in the exchange of goods between East and West. The way perfume and spices were used by societies tells us a lot about the values of the ancient world. They weren't just items for personal enjoyment, they were ways to project one's identity, to create a sense of mystique, and to assert power. For the kings and queens who had access to the finest perfumes, it wasn't just about the fragrance, it was about signalling their place at the top of the social hierarchy. Similarly, for the traders and merchants along the Silk Road, perfume and spices became currency in ways that went beyond just money. They became symbols of connections between people, between cultures, and between distant civilizations. Historians still argue whether perfume and spices held a more profound social and cultural significance, or if their true value lay in their economic worth. Some believe that the symbolism of these goods was what gave them their value, while others insist that it was the simple demand for these goods that made them so sought after. In the end, it's likely a combination of both, the material and the symbolic, that made perfume and spices such vital components of the Silk Road trade. But let's not forget the everyday people, the traders, the merchants, and the labourers who made this trade possible. Imagine yourself as one of these merchants. You're not just selling perfume or spices, you're participating in a larger system that connects the world. You're making a living, yes, but you're also part of something much bigger. You're a conduit between cultures, a bridge that connects people across vast distances. With every vial of rose oil or sack of pepper you sell, you're helping to shape the world in ways that will be felt for centuries to come. As we continue our journey along the Silk Road, remember that perfume and spices were more than just luxury items. They were symbols of a world connected by trade, by culture, by religion, and by power. The simple act of trading these goods was part of a greater story, one that unfolded over thousands of miles and hundreds of years. And as you walk through the markets of the Silk Road, you can almost feel the weight of history in the air as these goods pass from hand to hand, carrying with them the essence of the civilizations that created them. Historians still debate whether the Silk Road was primarily a vehicle for the exchange of goods, or whether it was the exchange of ideas and cultures that made the trade so transformative. It's clear that both played a role. Each influenced the other in ways that are still being uncovered today. The perfume, the spices, and the other goods weren't just commodities. They were tools that connected the world and helped shape it into the global network we know today. So, as we continue our journey down the Silk Road, remember that perfume and spices weren't just part of the trade. They were the lifeblood of a civilization, connecting people, ideas, and cultures in ways that no other trade route could match. As the caravan trudges onward, each step through the arid desert or the steep mountain trails brings you deeper into the world of ancient trade, where every merchant has a story and every good carries a legacy. But there's something uniquely fascinating about how the flow of perfume and spices across the Silk Road influenced not only the societies that consumed them, but the very infrastructure of the routes themselves. As you walk through the city gates, you realize that these goods weren't just crossing the land. They were shaping the cities and people who encountered them, creating an ecosystem that thrived on the exchange of luxury, health, and power. In the bustling markets of Samarkand or Baghdad, the influence of perfume and spices is clear. The perfume is stored in beautifully crafted vessels, some with intricate designs reflecting the cultural blend of Islamic, Persian, and Central Asian influences. The spices, cinnamon, cloves, and saffron, are displayed in vibrant mounds, their colours as rich as their history. These goods aren't just items to buy or sell, they are at the heart of the culture. Perfume bottles become heirlooms, passed down through generations as symbols of wealth and refinement. Spices, on the other hand, symbolise health, vitality, and the pursuit of longevity. They aren't just part of the daily routine, they're seen as essential elements for both the body and the soul. Perfume, for example, is much more than a pleasant scent. It's an experience, a personal statement of elegance and sophistication. The ancient world didn't just dab perfume on their bodies, it was a form of ritual. The nobility in these cities would use perfumes and incense in their homes, in their palaces, and during ceremonies. As much as these scented oils were luxury items, they also served a cultural purpose. In the Persian Empire, for instance, perfume was a part of royal rituals, used to anoint kings during their coronation ceremonies. It wasn't just about enhancing one's scent, it was about invoking divine favour and asserting one's right to rule. And this wasn't limited to just royalty. In fact, the wealthy merchant class saw their access to such luxurious goods as an extension of their power. Historians still argue whether perfume's primary purpose was ceremonial or personal. Some believe its sacred connotation and use in religious rituals gave it a divine status, while others think that it was all about personal opulence. No matter the interpretation, one thing is clear. The demand for perfume was as much about social and spiritual status as it was about scent. Spices, on the other hand, held an equally important but different position in society. The value of spices wasn't just about their exotic nature. They were deeply embedded in both the culinary and medical practices of the time. Saffron, cinnamon, and ginger weren't just for flavouring food. They were seen as cures for ailments, remedies for sickness, and ways to ensure a long, healthy life. Some historians argue that spices were one of the first truly global commodities. They were so highly valued that they not only made their way from India and Southeast Asia to Central Asia and the Mediterranean, but they also became central to the development of early medicine. The idea that what you consumed could heal you was as revolutionary as it was practical. Spices were often ground into pastes or used to make infusions that could cure everything from indigestion to fevers. The pharmaceutical qualities of spices made them invaluable in many societies along the Silk Road. But the story of perfume and spices isn't just one of luxury and medicine, it's also a story of diplomacy, of empires vying for control over these precious goods. The very trade routes themselves became battlefields of political and military influence. The Roman Empire, for example, became obsessed with controlling the spice trade. Pepper was particularly valuable, and the Romans sought to control the lands where it grew. The desire for spices, particularly pepper, drove Rome to establish trading relationships with the kingdoms of India and eventually to expand their reach into Southeast Asia. The empire wasn't just conquering lands, it was also attempting to control the flow of goods that would allow it to maintain its dominance over the Mediterranean world. Historians still debate whether the desire for spices directly influenced the expansion of the Roman Empire, or if it was simply a byproduct of larger geopolitical ambitions. While it's clear that the Roman elite craved exotic spices, many historians point out that spices were also a symbol of wealth and luxury, and that their presence in the empire's markets became a marker of Roman prosperity. In any case, the demand for these goods resulted in a network of trade routes stretching across continents, bringing together people who had never before met, and creating an interconnected world that was built on the exchange of perfume, spices, and other valuable commodities. As we continue our journey along the Silk Road, we start to realize just how interconnected the world was through this trade. The vast distances covered by caravans, whether by camel, horse, or on foot, are breathtaking, and the stories carried along with each precious good are as rich as the fragrances of the perfumes or the exotic flavors of the spices. Whether you're in the cities of Central Asia, Persia, or India, the presence of perfume and spices becomes a symbol of connection, of cultures blending and influencing each other in profound ways. This is where trade becomes more than just an exchange of goods. It's a bridge between civilizations, one that brings the world closer together, despite the challenges that lie between it. As the caravan winds its way westward, the importance of these goods, perfume and spices, becomes even more apparent. What began as a journey for material wealth soon transforms into a cultural odyssey. Perfume isn't just something to wear, it's a symbol of power, a sign of status and luxury. Spices aren't just items of commerce, they're ingredients of health, wealth, and longevity. The Silk Road isn't just a trade route, it's a living testament to the connections between East and West, between the tangible and the intangible, between what we can touch and what we can only smell, taste, and imagine. Historians still debate how far-reaching the impact of the Silk Road was on global culture. Was it truly the first global network, or was it one of many regional networks that eventually connected? What's clear is that through perfume and spices, the Silk Road left an indelible mark on the world, one that continues to influence us today. The journey along the Silk Road brings you deeper into a world where the flow of goods tells not just of material wealth, but of the exchange of dreams, ambitions, and even fears. As you continue westward, you find yourself entering cities that have grown prosperous on the back of these vibrant trade routes, each with its own pulse, rhythm, and unique character. But it's not just the perfume or spices that make these cities thrive, it's the people, their creativity, and their ability to turn trade into a cultural movement. As the caravan winds through the Silk Road's sprawling network, it's clear that what we're witnessing is more than just commerce. We're witnessing the rise of a new world order, one based on exchange, influence, and the influence of both scent and taste. Imagine yourself in one of the great cities like Baghdad or Damascus, bustling with merchants and travelers from every corner of the known world. The air is filled with the mingling scents of cinnamon, saffron, rose oil, and myrrh. The scent of perfume isn't just in the air, it's in the very atmosphere of the city, pervading every corner. Here, the streets are alive with the hum of negotiation, the sound of haggling over fine goods, and the persistent call of street vendors selling everything from incense to spices. In a city like this, perfume is no longer just a luxury. It's a commodity that represents the city's access to distant lands, its place in the great network of the Silk Road. In these cities, perfume and spices aren't simply traded as luxuries, they are central to the way people live. For the wealthy elite, perfume is an essential part of daily life. But it's also something much more personal. Perfume is an expression of identity, a reflection of the wearer's status and power. From the scented oils used by the sultans in their courtrooms to the incense burned in mosques to elevate the spirits, scent becomes not just an indulgence, but an extension of culture. There is something almost mystical about the experience of scent in these places. Perfume, spices, and incense take on a life of their own, adding to the sense of wonder that the Silk Road evokes. Historians still debate the cultural significance of perfume in the ancient world. Was it merely a sign of wealth? Or did it serve a deeper purpose in ritualistic practices and spiritual beliefs? Many argue that scent was intrinsically linked to the divine. In ancient religions, the burning of incense was seen as a way of offering prayers to the gods, a practice that carried over into the religious ceremonies of the Silk Road's many civilizations. Perfume was not just about luxury, it was about creating an atmosphere of holiness and reverence. For many of the societies along the Silk Road, the connection between scent and the divine was undeniable. The role of perfume in these societies was so pervasive that it found its way into art, literature, and music. Poets and musicians would often write about the intoxicating effects of perfume, associating the sweet scents with beauty, love, and even divine intervention. The imagery of perfume as a symbol of purity and grace was present in the works of poets from Persia to Arabia, and its influence permeated literature across the ancient world. You can almost imagine the sweet scent of roses and jasmine wafting through the verses of ancient poetry carried on the winds of history. But perfume wasn't just confined to the courts of the elite. It had practical uses as well. Spices such as ginger, cinnamon, and turmeric were valued not only for their medicinal properties, but also for their ability to preserve food. In an age without refrigeration, the preservation of food was essential to survival, and spices became a vital part of daily life. Ginger was used for its ability to settle the stomach, cinnamon was used for its warming properties, and saffron, one of the most expensive spices, was used both for flavour and for its purported health benefits. Spices weren't just for wealthy households either. They made their way into the homes of the ordinary people too. In the bustling marketplaces of cities like Alexandria or Constantinople, traders would offer smaller quantities of spices that could be bought by anyone who could afford them. These spices didn't just enhance the flavour of food, they were believed to have healing properties, to prevent disease, and to offer protection against the harsh realities of life. For example, the ancient Egyptians believed that cinnamon had protective powers and used it in burial rituals. The idea that spices could be both medicinal and protective spread throughout the civilizations of the Silk Road, making them an essential part of everyday life. Historians still argue about the significance of spices in ancient medical practices. Was their value mainly due to their physical benefits, or did they also carry symbolic meaning? Many historians point out that in ancient times, spices were often seen as sacred substances, believed to be endowed with mystical properties. The use of spices in religious rituals, such as the burning of incense in temples, or the anointing of holy figures with perfumed oils, suggests that these substances were seen as more than just practical. They were conduits to the divine. The importance of perfume and spices is also tied to the rise of commerce and the expansion of empires. The desire for these luxury goods became a driving force behind the expansion of empires like the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, and later the Islamic Caliphates. The Roman Empire, for instance, sought control of the spice trade, especially pepper, which was considered a form of currency in many parts of the empire. The Romans even referred to pepper as black gold, so precious was it to their society. But it wasn't just the Romans who sought these goods. By the time the Islamic Caliphates rose to power, they had already established a vast trade network that connected the Mediterranean to India and beyond. Historians still debate the impact of perfume and spices on the rise of these empires. Some argue that the demand for these goods fueled territorial expansion, while others suggest that the cultural significance of these items was what really drove their value. Either way, there's no denying that perfume and spices became central to the development of global trade networks, paving the way for the spread of ideas, cultures, and technologies. As we continue along this journey, we start to see how perfume and spices didn't just shape the cities along the Silk Road, they shaped the very nature of the world itself. The act of trading these goods, the cultural exchange that accompanied them, and the influence they had on the societies that consumed them are testament to the transformative power of the Silk Road. It wasn't just a route for the exchange of goods, it was a conduit for the exchange of dreams, beliefs, and identities, where the scent of perfume and the flavour of spices carried with them the weight of history. Historians still argue whether it was the cultural, political, or economic forces that made the Silk Road such a transformative force in history. What is clear is that perfume and spices, more than mere commodities, played a key role in the unfolding of this ancient network, creating connections that continue to resonate through time. As we continue our journey through the intricate weave of the Silk Road, we find that perfume and spices weren't just commodities to be traded. They were touchstones of the ancient world, intimately tied to the very fabric of society. These goods weren't just exchanged for their material worth, they were symbols of the interconnectedness of distant civilizations. The trade of perfume and spices across this ancient network wasn't simply a matter of supply and demand, it was about the cultural, spiritual, and economic bridges these goods built between cultures that had never before encountered one another. Let's pause for a moment to think about how the very concept of luxury itself evolved along the Silk Road. The idea of what constituted luxury goods, whether it be perfume, spices, or fine silks, was largely shaped by the desires of the elites who ruled these regions. For those who could afford them, these goods weren't just things to possess. They were an expression of power, of refined taste, and of global reach. The finest perfumes created by skilled artisans in Persia and India were sought after by kings, queens, and nobles throughout the ancient world. These perfumes were more than just pleasant smells. They were woven with meaning and power. The oils, resins, and flowers used to create these fragrant masterpieces came from far-flung places, often making them exclusive to the wealthiest individuals. As you walk through these ancient cities, you realize that perfume wasn't just about scent, it was about the experience it created. It evoked beauty, spirituality, and wealth all at once. Picture a royal banquet in the heart of Persia, where attendants anoint the rulers with oils made from the rarest flowers, while fragrant incense fills the air. The guests would have been immersed in an atmosphere of opulence and divine favour, where every sense was engaged and every element had meaning. Perfume served not only as an accessory for the wealthy, it was a way for these elites to reinforce their authority. The ability to access the finest and most exclusive fragrances was a marker of status, and a way of demonstrating one's connection to both the divine and the powerful. But the use of perfume and spices wasn't confined to the wealthy alone. In fact, these goods filtered down to the middle class, changing the way ordinary people lived and interacted with their world. Spices, which had once been used solely by the elite for culinary and medicinal purposes, became more widely available as trade routes expanded. While they may not have been as accessible as they were for royalty, the middle class began to incorporate spices into their diets, using them for flavouring, preserving food, and even for medicinal purposes. It's easy to imagine the bustling markets of Baghdad or Cairo, filled with the smell of garlic, turmeric, and cinnamon, where spices became a part of everyday life, not just for the rich, but for everyone who could afford them. These spices weren't just culinary indulgences, they were intertwined with health practices that spanned continents. Ginger, for example, was believed to have powerful healing properties, able to cure everything from indigestion to colds. Cinnamon was known not just for its warm, sweet flavour, but for its ability to regulate blood sugar and promote general health. These ancient uses of spices in both cooking and medicine would become foundational to the development of global pharmacology. Even today, the medicinal value of many of these ancient spices is being rediscovered by modern science. Historians still argue whether the primary value of spices in the ancient world lay in their culinary uses or their medicinal properties. Some believe that the therapeutic aspects of spices drove their value, while others suggest that their exotic nature and ability to enhance food flavours were what made them so highly prized. Regardless of their use, There's no denying that the trade in spices changed the course of human history, shaping both the development of cultures and the very economies of entire regions. As the caravan moves deeper into the heart of the Silk Road, the interplay between perfume and spices becomes increasingly apparent. These two commodities, though seemingly distinct, are intertwined in ways that define the cultural exchange taking place. Perfume represents the luxury and divine connection that the elites sought to cultivate. Spices, on the other hand, are tied to more practical concerns: health, survival, and sustenance. But in the marketplace, these goods aren't just practical items, they represent the convergence of two worlds, one focused on beauty, power, and the divine, the other grounded in the day-to-day needs of ordinary people striving for wellness and comfort. We're reminded again that the Silk Road wasn't just about material goods. It was about the exchange of ideas, the blending of cultures, and the emergence of a global system that we now see as the precursor to our modern world. The flow of perfume and spices along this network tells a story of human connection and exchange. How, over centuries, the world's disparate cultures began to understand each other, share knowledge, and build an interconnected world that would change forever. Historians still debate the extent to which the Silk Road influenced the cultural exchange between East and West. Was it truly the flow of goods like perfume and spices that united the world, or was it the exchange of ideas, philosophies, and religions that played a more significant role? Some historians suggest that trade was the catalyst for cultural exchange, while others believe that the real revolution lay in the exchange of knowledge, scientific discoveries, religious practices, and technological innovations. But whether it was the goods themselves or the ideas behind them, there's no denying that the Silk Road created a global network that would eventually shape the future of human civilization. As the caravan makes its way through the rugged terrain, you can't help but feel the weight of the history that surrounds you. You're walking through a world that's been shaped by the very goods that pass through your hands: perfume, spices, and silks that have travelled thousands of miles to get here. These simple items, often overlooked in our daily lives, have shaped societies, economies, and even the course of history. The Silk Road isn't just a trade route. It's a living testament to the enduring power of connection and the human desire to explore, trade, and understand each other. As we move further along the Silk Road, the path becomes less defined by the physical terrain and more by the invisible threads that tie cultures together. We've already seen how perfume and spices influence the powerful elite and everyday citizens alike. But now, as we enter the heart of the trade network, we begin to see how these items became the very fabric of international diplomacy. You can almost hear the clinking of gold coins, the soft murmurs of foreign tongues, and the creak of camel saddles as goods, scented oils, spices, and luxury items continue their slow, methodical journey across continents. The cities of the Silk Road, from Samarkand to Baghdad, aren't just thriving on commerce, they're thriving on the diplomacy that surrounds this trade. Perfume and spices, once considered mere luxuries, have now become symbols of political alliances. The exchange of these goods isn't just a matter of economics, it's a carefully orchestrated dance between empires and kingdoms, where a vial of rose oil or a sack of pepper could open doors to diplomatic discussions and forge powerful alliances. The trade of such commodities has become an art of negotiation, where one wrong move or a bad deal could sour relations and tip the balance of power in the region. Picture yourself as one of the merchants, travelling through the Persian Empire on your way to Byzantium, carrying not only your goods but the weight of political expectations. You might not be an official envoy, but every trade you make, every gift of perfume or spice you present carries diplomatic weight. A lavish gift of rare frankincense to a foreign ruler could be the key to a treaty. It's not just about exchanging goods, it's about negotiating power, establishing trust, and creating networks that go beyond the trade of material items. Historians still debate the extent to which perfume and spices played a direct role in international diplomacy. Some believe that the symbolism behind these goods elevated them to the status of political currency. Others argue that the goods were simply commodities traded for their inherent value, with little deeper political significance. However, the fact remains that these commodities were integral to the functioning of the Silk Road. The flow of goods wasn't just an economic exchange, it was a cultural and diplomatic exchange that intertwined people, empires, and ideas. Perfume, as a diplomatic gift, was particularly significant. The rarest perfumes were crafted with ingredients that could only be found in specific regions, making them rare treasures in their own right. When sent as gifts, these perfumes weren't just an indulgence, they were a signal of goodwill, a gesture of respect, and sometimes even a subtle message of power. Perfume became a way to communicate what words couldn't. A fragrant gift could mean peace, friendship, or the promise of future cooperation. It was as much about what was unsaid as what was said aloud, as these gifts were often steeped in symbolism. Similarly, spices like saffron, cinnamon, and ginger had diplomatic significance as well. These goods were not just part of regular commerce, they were often exchanged as part of treaties or pacts between nations. The desire for spices, especially pepper, had long been a driving force in the geopolitical landscape. Empires and kingdoms with control over the spice trade held considerable power, and the ability to manipulate the flow of these precious goods could shift the balance of power in an instant. The trade of spices wasn't just about food, it was about control, influence, and maintaining dominance over strategic trade routes. But beyond the political significance, perfume and spices also played a role in the spiritual and religious life of the Silk Road civilizations. As the caravan winds its way further westward, you can see that incense and scented oils were used in temples, palaces, and homes for spiritual purposes. The use of fragrant oils in religious rituals wasn't just about creating an atmosphere, it was about invoking the divine. In ancient Egypt, the use of myrrh and frankincense was considered sacred, and these substances were often burned as offerings to the gods. The same practice carried over into the spiritual practices of the cultures along the Silk Road. From the temples of India to the mosques of the Middle East, the use of perfume and incense was woven into the fabric of religious devotion. Historians still argue whether the use of perfume in religious rituals was more symbolic or functional. Some argue that scent had a direct impact on the worshipper's connection to the divine, while others believe it was simply an aesthetic practice. However, it's clear that the use of perfume in these rituals helped to reinforce the sacred nature of the Silk Road trade. The fragrances weren't just used in temples, they were used to anoint sacred objects, to bless individuals, and to mark significant events. The act of using perfume and spices in religious practices elevated these goods beyond mere luxuries and transformed them into sacred substances that had the power to transcend the physical world. The spiritual and political significance of perfume and spices makes them more than just trade items. They are emblematic of the broader interconnectedness of civilizations. These goods were integral to the way people along the Silk Road understood their world, how they navigated their relationships with others, how they perceived the divine, and how they established their place in the grand geopolitical landscape. With every vial of perfume exchanged, with every spice traded, the Silk Road continued to weave its tapestry of human connection, a network that bridged vast distances and created a shared world where cultures and ideas could collide, merge, and thrive. As the caravan passes through these great cities, where perfume is more than just fragrance and spices more than flavour, we begin to see how these goods helped shape the world in ways that go far beyond what we might expect. Perfume and spices weren't just commodities, they were vehicles of diplomacy, power, and culture. They weren't just traded for their material worth, they were traded for the way they represented the aspirations of the people who sought them and the civilizations that cultivated them. Historians still argue whether the Silk Road's true significance was in the exchange of goods or the cultural shifts they caused. Some say it was the tangible goods that mattered, while others believe the true value lay in the exchange of knowledge and culture that accompanied these goods. Regardless of the perspective, one thing is certain: perfume and spices played a central role in the success of the Silk Road and the rise of a globalized world. The caravan moves onward through the sprawling plains and towering mountains of the Silk Road, but the journey is beginning to take on a deeper, more profound significance. At first, we might have seen perfume and spices as luxury items that connected distant lands through trade, but as we approach the crossroads where East and West meet, we realize that the true power of these goods lies not just in their material value, but in their ability to transform lives and reshape entire civilizations. As you continue on this journey, consider how the flow of these commodities was central not only to the economy, but to the very fabric of daily life. In the great city of Baghdad, for example, you notice how the presence of perfume has become as essential to the city's identity as its rich libraries and vibrant marketplace. Perfume is more than just something worn on the body. It's interwoven into the daily rituals of life. It's used during prayers, as offerings to the gods, and even in medical practices. Perfume, once confined to the courtly elite, has now become a symbol of a city that thrives on trade, culture, and the blending of ideas. The merchants here don't just trade goods, they trade knowledge, philosophies, and religious practices. What's truly remarkable is how the trade in perfume and spices was a conduit for the transmission of ideas. Think for a moment about how the use of fragrance spread across cultures along the Silk Road. As the caravan moves westward, perfume and spices begin to carry new meanings with them. What was once an exclusively luxury item for the rich in the East becomes more accessible in the West. The scents of saffron, cinnamon, and frankincense find their way into religious practices in places like Jerusalem and Constantinople, where they're used not just to anoint the body, but as sacred offerings to the gods. The power of these goods lies in their ability to transcend their origins, taking on new forms and new meanings as they move from one culture to the next. Perfume is a commodity that knows no boundaries. A vial of rose oil, once brewed by a perfumer in the royal courts of Persia, might find its way to a humble temple in India, where it's used to invoke blessings from the gods. The spices carried across the deserts from India become part of a new culinary tradition in the Mediterranean, influencing the flavours of Greek and Roman cuisine, and later Italian dishes. The exchange of perfume and spices is not simply an exchange of products, it is the exchange of beliefs, practices, and innovations that span continents. Historians still debate how far-reaching this cultural exchange was, and how much influence the trade of perfume and spices had on shaping civilizations. Some suggest that the greatest impact of these goods was not in the goods themselves, but in how they served as vehicles for transmitting cultural knowledge. For instance, the introduction of saffron to the Mediterranean wasn't just about the spice itself, it was about the culinary and medicinal practices that came with it. Similarly, perfume spread across the Silk Road was not merely about luxury, it was about the rituals, the philosophy, and the practices associated with fragrance that impacted cultures from the Middle East to the Far East. Perhaps the most profound transformation caused by this trade was the way it elevated the everyday lives of people. You might imagine the life of a merchant in one of the Silk Road's many cities. For them, perfume and spices were not just exotic luxuries, they were also vital to their survival and daily work. Spices could be used to preserve food, to fight illness, and to enhance flavour. Perfume, with its rich and divine symbolism, carried not just the power to elevate social status, but also to provide comfort, safety, and healing. These goods were often more than mere indulgences. They were tools that enabled people to live fuller, healthier lives. In this sense, perfume and spices were revolutionary. They weren't just items of trade, they were part of the social fabric. The pursuit of these goods led to the development of new technologies, new ways of preserving food and health, and even new philosophical outlooks. The wealth generated by the perfume and spice trade helped build cities and empires, but it also helped foster the growth of ideas that would change the world. Historians argue whether the exchange of perfume and spices on the Silk Road was truly the driving force behind the rise of trade networks, or if the desire for wealth and power simply made trade inevitable. Was it the goods themselves that led to the prosperity of the Silk Road, or was it the people, driven by ambition, curiosity, and the thirst for knowledge, that made the trade thrive? While we may never have a definitive answer, it is clear that the exchange of these goods laid the groundwork for the world's first truly global trade network, one that would change the trajectory of human history. Even as we approach the end of our journey, we're reminded that the legacy of the Silk Road is not just in the physical goods that crossed it, but in the intangible exchange of culture, knowledge, and connection. The fragrance of jasmine, the warm spices of cinnamon, and the rare oils of sandalwood carried with them far more than just scents. They carried the stories of peoples and civilizations, their hopes and struggles, and their capacity to shape the world in ways that still reverberate today. Now, imagine the lasting impact of the perfume and spice trade. In cities like Constantinople, where traders from across the globe converge, these goods continue to circulate, transcending borders and uniting people across vast distances. The Silk Road may have come to an end in physical terms, but its legacy lives on in the way we understand global trade, cultural exchange, and the power of simple goods to change the course of history. Perfume and spices weren't just luxury items. They were the threads that connected the East and West, the tangible manifestation of human connection. They brought together distant cultures, religions and philosophies, creating an interconnected world where ideas and goods could flow freely, fostering an era of unprecedented cultural and economic exchange. Historians still argue whether the legacy of the Silk Road is best understood through its economic impact or its cultural influence. Regardless, it's undeniable that perfume and spices played a central role in the global exchanges that defined this ancient trade network, and that their legacy continues to shape the way we view the world today. As the caravan nears the end of its long journey, the scent of perfume and the flavour of spices linger in the air, intertwining with the memories of countless traders, explorers, and empires that passed this way before. The flow of goods has not only created immense wealth, but has also spurred the development of technologies, ideas, and innovations that would shape the course of history. The Silk Road, at its peak, was more than just a trade route. It was a lifeline for the exchange of culture, knowledge, and belief. The journey we've taken across the Silk Road reveals something extraordinary. Perfume and spices, though simple in their nature, are symbolic of something much larger. They embody the idea of global connection, the concept that people, goods, and ideas, regardless of their origin, can come together to create something greater than the sum of their parts. The perfume that once travelled from Persia to Rome carried not just scent, but the weight of empires and civilizations. The spices from India and Southeast Asia weren't merely food additives. They were the essence of cultural exchange, the glue that held together distant and often disparate parts of the world. Now, as we stand at the crossroads where East meets West, we see that the legacy of the Silk Road isn't just in the products that were traded, but in the relationships that were formed. It wasn't just about the perfume traded from city to city, or the rare spices that made their way to the Mediterranean. It was about the people who carried these goods with them, the merchants, diplomats, scholars, and travellers who made the exchange of goods possible. The caravanserais and trading hubs, where merchants would rest after long journeys, weren't just places for commerce, they were places of cultural convergence. It was here that ideas from the East met the philosophies of the West, where the sciences, religions, and arts were shared and adapted. And as perfume and spices made their way across the trade routes, they carried with them not just the material wealth of empires, but the wealth of human curiosity. The exchange of these goods encouraged people to explore new territories, to engage with different cultures, and to rethink the very boundaries of the world they knew. The Silk Road allowed humanity to imagine a world not separated by borders and oceans, but connected by trade, curiosity, and mutual benefit. Every trade of saffron or rose oil wasn't just an economic transaction, it was an opportunity for people to engage in something larger than themselves, to participate in a shared global history that spanned continents and generations. Historians still argue over the lasting impact of the Silk Road. Was its true significance economic or cultural? Did it primarily serve as a conduit for trade, or did it lay the foundations for cultural and intellectual exchange? While these questions continue to be debated, what is clear is that perfume and spices played a pivotal role in making the Silk Road the cultural and economic force that it became. These goods were more than just items to be traded. They were part of a greater movement, a flow of culture, commerce, and communication that transformed the ancient world. As you imagine the life of a merchant or a trader on this journey, it becomes clear that the flow of goods like perfume and spices wasn't merely about wealth. It was about forging connections. These goods carried with them the stories and dreams of the people who created them, and through their trade, the world became smaller, more interconnected. It wasn't just the wealthy who profited from this exchange. Every individual who came into contact with these goods was participating in the shaping of global history. The Silk Road's significance lies in the fact that it brought together people from different continents, different backgrounds, and different civilizations, all united by their desire to share in the wealth of the world. And perfume and spices were among the most tangible symbols of this exchange. They weren't just luxurious commodities, they were vehicles of diplomacy, culture, religion, and ultimately human connection. They represented the triumph of trade as a force that could cross boundaries and create lasting relationships that would reverberate through the centuries. Now, as we come to the end of this journey, it's worth reflecting on the impact of the Silk Road, not just in the grand sweep of history, but in the way we understand the world today. The very idea of a global network where goods and ideas could flow freely is something that continues to shape our modern world. In many ways, the legacy of the Silk Road is alive and well today in the international trade networks that span the globe. Perfume and spices may not hold the same political weight as they did centuries ago, but their legacy as symbols of global trade and cultural exchange still resonates in every international transaction, every global market, and every cultural exchange that occurs in the world today. Historians still debate whether the Silk Road's true legacy lies in its material wealth or its cultural impact. Was it the exchange of goods, like perfume and spices, that made it so powerful? Or was it the broader exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultures that really changed the world? Ultimately, the answer may be that both are true. The Silk Road was not just a highway of goods, it was a pathway of ideas, a bridge between distant worlds, a conduit for human progress that helped shape the modern world. As we end our journey, let's remember that the perfume and spices that once travelled along these ancient roads weren't just about wealth or luxury. They were about the connections between people, between cultures, between distant lands. They represent the enduring spirit of trade, curiosity, and human connection, and they remind us that even the smallest exchange of goods can have a lasting impact on the world. As we reach the final stages of this journey along the Silk Road, the significance of perfume and spices continues to reveal itself not just as a trade of goods, but as an exchange that laid the foundation for much of the world we know today. While we've walked through the bustling markets, discussed the luxurious perfumes and exotic spices, and examined how they influenced civilizations both economically and culturally, we now see the broader picture. The Silk Road, in its heyday, wasn't merely a conduit for commerce. It was the bridge between worlds that would shape empires, cultures, and global histories for centuries to come. The trade routes that spanned from China to the Mediterranean were more than just roads. They were threads woven into the fabric of human civilization, stitching together diverse peoples, philosophies, and traditions into a singular, if sprawling, network of global interaction. And at the heart of this connection were the goods we followed: perfume and spices. They were not just valuable because of their scarcity or the luxury they represented, but because they helped to foster the very concept of international exchange. As the caravan winds its way through ancient cities, the last vestiges of the Silk Road trade become clear. Cities like Istanbul, Alexandria, and even as far east as Xi'an were once epicenters of this great global movement, where perfume from Persia and spices from India were exchanged not just for coin, but for stories, ideas, and innovations. As each merchant made their way down these well-travelled paths, they brought with them not only goods, but the very culture of the places they represented. In these cities, perfume and spices were symbols of an interconnected world that transcended borders. The wealthy sat in palatial courtyards, surrounded by the fragrant aromas of incense and spices, their very existence sustained by the goods that flowed across these trade routes. It's at these final points on the road where we begin to understand that the Silk Road wasn't just a commercial exchange, it was the first great global network. Perfume and spices were the visible commodities that allowed the invisible exchanges of knowledge, culture, and religion to take place. In a way, they acted as the passport between worlds. Through perfume, we see the blending of religious and cultural practices. Through spices, we understand how health and food preservation became essential to the survival of civilizations. Every good that travelled along the Silk Road helped shape the world in profound ways. Historians still debate the true extent of the Silk Road's influence, asking whether its economic impact was more significant than its cultural contributions, or whether it was the exchange of ideas that truly drove the development of civilizations. In one sense, we might argue that perfume and spices were the symbols that mark the intersection of these different realms. These goods weren't merely traded for their material worth, they were part of the larger story of how cultures intersected and influenced each other. Whether in medicine, religion, or cuisine, perfume and spices transcended their simple physical forms to become conduits for profound change. For example, as perfume made its way from the courts of Persia to those in Rome and beyond, it didn't just bring with it a new way of smelling. It was a marker of sophistication, a tool of diplomacy, and in some cases an offering for favour or allegiance. The same can be said of spices. As they travelled across continents, from India's bustling spice markets to the Mediterranean's lavish kitchens, they became symbols of health and well-being, changing culinary practices and even influencing the very foundation of medicine. The spices exchanged along the Silk Road were not only meant to enhance flavour, they were believed to have the power to cure diseases, improve health, and ensure longevity. This exchange wasn't just a transfer of goods, it was a melding of ideas. The spices traded for centuries eventually made their way into global medicine. The belief that cinnamon and ginger could cure digestive issues, or that saffron could improve mood and prevent ailments, became part of a universal knowledge system. Meanwhile, the creation and use of perfumes became a spiritual practice, with scented oils used in everything from anointing holy figures to performing religious ceremonies. The very act of scenting the air, it seemed, became an important part of the ritualistic practices that grew across cultures. Historians also continue to argue about the geopolitical impact of the Silk Road. The desire for control over perfume and spice production was central to the rise and fall of many great empires. The Persian Empire sought to control the trade in frankincense and myrrh, while the Roman Empire's obsession with controlling the spice trade led to their eventual expansion into Southeast Asia. The subsequent Arab Empire expanded trade routes through the Middle East, controlling not only spices but the essential roads that connected the East to the West. As we near the end of this great journey, we realize that perfume and spices, once simply markers of wealth, have shaped the very course of history. These goods connected the far corners of the world in a way that nothing else could. While silk and gold were undoubtedly valuable, it was the scents of roses, the warmth of cinnamon, and the bite of ginger that drew people from all walks of life together. These small, often overlooked items created pathways for the exchange of knowledge, religion, art, and even warfare. In a sense, perfume and spices were the subtle, powerful agents that wove the first global tapestry, shaping the world we live in today. The influence of perfume and spices extends far beyond their time on the Silk Road. They laid the foundation for modern trade networks and, in many ways, were the precursors to the global exchange of ideas and goods we take for granted today. And as we reflect on their legacy, we realize that the Silk Road was more than just a route for merchants. It was a conduit for change, and perfume and spices were the threads that wove it all together. Historians still debate whether the greatest impact of the Silk Road came from the exchange of physical goods or the intangible cultural exchange that accompanied them. It's a question that might never have a definitive answer, but as we've seen, perfume and spices weren't just material possessions. They were the symbols of a connected world, and they continue to resonate with us today. As we approach the final stages of our journey along the Silk Road, the importance of perfume and spices becomes more apparent. What once seemed like simple trade goods, exchanged for their material value, now reveal themselves as powerful agents of change. The Silk Road, which facilitated the passage of silk, spices, perfumes, and many other goods, was not just a route for commerce, it was a conduit for the exchange of ideas, culture, and innovation that would shape civilizations for centuries to come. While the physical goods, fragrant oils and exotic spices, were traded across vast distances, they also symbolized something much deeper. They were a part of a broader human network, connecting people across continents, across cultures, and through time. Every caravan that moved along the Silk Road didn't just carry spices and perfumes, they carried the hopes, dreams, and ambitions of the civilizations that created them. Through their trade, cultures met, mingled, and influenced one another, leaving behind a legacy that we can still trace today. Perfume and spices were not just luxury items for the rich. They were integral to religious, medicinal, and social practices. They were used in ceremonies, anointed upon kings and queens, and burned as offerings to the gods. The same spices that made their way to the kitchens of Europe were used in the healing rituals of China, India, and the Middle East. The medicinal properties of cinnamon, ginger, and saffron weren't just passed along as recipes for food. They became part of a global understanding of health and well-being, transcending their culinary origins. Historians still debate the broader significance of the Silk Road, whether it was truly a trade route for goods, or whether its more profound impact lay in the transfer of knowledge and ideas. Some scholars suggest that the exchange of goods like perfume and spices was the most visible element of the Silk Road, but it was the exchange of philosophical and scientific knowledge that truly defined its legacy. Others argue that the wealth generated by the trade in these goods spurred the development of empires and cities that would, in turn, become centres for innovation and cultural exchange. The political impact of the Silk Road cannot be overstated. Perfume and spices became symbols of power and influence, not only in the courts of kings and sultans, but also among the merchant classes who controlled the flow of these commodities. The desire to control the spice trade led to the rise and fall of empires, from the Roman Empire to the Islamic caliphates and beyond. The rise of the maritime Silk Road in the later centuries shows how the pursuit of these goods influenced the exploration of new lands, sparking global trade routes that extended far beyond Asia and into the New World. The cities along the Silk Road, from Samarkand to Constantinople, became not just centres of commerce but hubs of intellectual exchange. As goods like perfume and spices passed through these cities, they were accompanied by the stories, philosophies, and religious practices of the people who traded them. The merchants, scholars, and travellers who passed through these cities were not merely selling and buying. They were engaging in dialogue, exchanging knowledge that would impact civilizations for generations. We can trace the influence of the Silk Road today in the spread of Eastern medicine, global culinary traditions, and even in the arts. The spices that first arrived in Europe from the East, like saffron, cinnamon, and nutmeg, are now staples in kitchens worldwide. The perfumes and essential oils that were once reserved for royalty and the elite are now part of everyday life for people all over the world. The enduring legacy of these goods is not only in their continued popularity, but in the way they have shaped our understanding of culture, trade, and connectivity. Historians still debate whether the Silk Road's lasting legacy is more cultural or economic. Some argue that the goods themselves, the perfume, the spices, the silks, were the true drivers of history. Others suggest that it was the cultural exchange that took place along these routes that truly shaped the world. What is undeniable, however, is that perfume and spices were at the centre of this exchange, and they helped create a shared global history that united people across vast distances. Looking back on the journey, we can see that perfume and spices were far more than just material goods. They were symbols of the interconnected world that the Silk Road helped create. They were the products of a vast network of trade, culture, and innovation. And as they passed from hand to hand, from one civilization to the next, they carried with them the spirit of human connection, an enduring legacy that continues to shape the world today. As the final caravan of goods makes its way toward its destination, we're left with a profound understanding of how the Silk Road was much more than just a trade route. It was a meeting place for cultures, a space for the exchange of knowledge, and a conduit for the ideas, innovations, and goods that have shaped our world. The perfume and spices we followed along this path were not just items traded for their value. They were symbols of the human desire to connect, to explore, and to share. The Silk Road may have faded into history, but its legacy remains in the goods we continue to trade, the knowledge we continue to exchange, and the connections we continue to make. And perfume and spices, symbols of luxury, health, and culture, continue to be reminders of the enduring power of the Silk Road. As the caravan's journey draws to a close, the fragrance of perfume and the lingering taste of spices serve as a bittersweet reminder of the immense journey we've undertaken, not just across deserts and mountains, but through the intricate web of cultures, histories, and ideas that the Silk Road connected. We've travelled through bustling markets, crossed empires, and witnessed how these seemingly simple goods, perfume and spices, transformed lives, economies, and entire civilizations. What stands out now at the end of this journey is how these goods were much more than just economic transactions. They were threads that wove a greater fabric of human connection. Perfume, with its associations to beauty, wealth, and spirituality, became more than an item of luxury. It became a universal marker of status, influence, and personal identity. Spices, once considered rare treasures spread across cultures, becoming integral to daily life, health practices, and even religious rituals. Through these goods, the world itself transformed into a network of interconnected peoples, with common goals, shared knowledge, and intertwined destinies. Perfume and spices weren't just items to be traded, they were catalysts for change. As we think back on the ancient merchants who carried these goods across mountains and deserts, we see that their journey was about more than simply moving goods from one place to another. They were the original architects of a global exchange, laying the groundwork for the interconnected world we inhabit today. The perfume they carried wasn't just to make people smell good. It helped create alliances, foster diplomatic relationships, and build empires. The spices, meanwhile, didn't just flavour food, they shaped the culinary traditions of multiple continents, created medicinal systems that spanned nations, and even became the basis for trade wars and territorial conquest. Historians still debate the full impact of the Silk Road on world history. Was the exchange of goods, like perfume and spices, the primary catalyst for cultural exchange? Or did the flow of ideas and technologies have an equally profound effect? What is indisputable, however, is that the Silk Road was not just a path for material goods, it was a bridge for human connection, and perfume and spices were the symbols of that bridge. As we reflect on the global importance of the Silk Road, it's important to recognize that while the trade of luxury goods like perfume and spices made fortunes for many, it also laid the foundation for an interconnected world. Empires that once seemed isolated from one another were now linked by trade routes that allowed ideas to travel as freely as goods. The people who traded perfume and spices, along with countless other merchants, were the pioneers of the global system we now take for granted. Perhaps most fascinating of all is the fact that perfume and spices, both so central to the success of the Silk Road, are still with us today, just as important in many cultures as they were thousands of years ago. Perfume remains a sign of luxury and status, a marker of both personal expression and cultural identity. Spices continue to shape global cuisine, and their use in medicine has only grown as new research unveils their healing properties. In some ways, the trade of these goods never truly stopped. It simply evolved, growing with the times, adapting to new cultures, new economies, and new technologies. Historians still debate whether the Silk Road's true legacy lies in the economic wealth it generated or the cultural and intellectual exchanges it facilitated. Was it the flow of commodities like perfume and spices that created lasting change, or was it the ideas they carried with them? Perhaps the answer is both. These goods acted as messengers, carrying with them not just the wealth of distant lands, but the knowledge, beliefs, and practices that would transform societies. The legacy of the Silk Road is not merely in the goods that passed along it, but in the lasting impact of those exchanges, an impact that we continue to feel today. Perfume and spices were not just luxuries, but key drivers of the Silk Road's power. The luxury of scent and flavour crossed borders, transcended language barriers, and helped create a shared global history. These goods became symbols of the enduring desire for connection, for mutual exchange, and for the improvement of life. They were part of a greater movement, one that pushed humanity to reach across boundaries, build new relationships, and share not just wealth, but wisdom. And so, as we near the end of our journey, we find ourselves with a deeper appreciation for the Silk Road and its lasting impact on the world. The perfume that once symbolized luxury, the spices that once changed the flavors of ancient kitchens, were more than just trade goods. They were symbols of humanity's greatest strengths, our desire to connect, to learn, and to grow. These simple commodities still carry the stories of the people who traded them, who built empires on them, and who paved the way for a world that, though vastly different from that ancient time, still holds the essence of the Silk Road at its core. Historians will continue to debate the true impact of the Silk Road on global history. Still, it's clear that perfume and spices played an outsized role in the global movement of ideas, people, and goods. These goods helped shape cultures, bridge gaps between civilizations, and create a world that was more interconnected than ever before. And now, as we look around us, we see that the legacy of perfume and spices continues to shape the modern world in ways we may not even recognize. These goods may no longer be the luxury they once were, but their ability to influence and connect people remains timeless. So, as you close your eyes and breathe in the lingering scent of this journey, know that the Silk Road has left its mark, not just on the ancient world, but on the world we live in today. As we close the final chapters of our journey along the Silk Road, the story of perfume and spices doesn't end with their physical passage from one place to another. No, their legacy endures in the very structure of the global world we navigate today. The goods themselves, saffron, cinnamon, myrrh, and jasmine, may seem like mere relics of ancient trade, but their influence has shaped our modern world in ways we might not always recognize. Every time we open a bottle of perfume or sprinkle a bit of cinnamon in a dish, we're paying homage to the ancient roots that brought these precious items to the farthest corners of the earth. The Silk Road, once a web of overland and maritime routes connecting east and west, is a legacy of more than just trade. It is a symbol of human curiosity, ingenuity, and connection. From the Chinese emperor's court to the deserts of Arabia, perfume and spices were agents of change, sometimes quiet, sometimes loud, but always influential. These goods weren't simply commodities. They were vehicles for ideas, rituals, and philosophies that transformed the way people lived, worshipped, and interacted. Through perfume and spices, the world came to see the value of exchange, of not just sharing material goods, but knowledge, art, and culture. As we reach the end of this tale, we realize that perfume and spices were so much more than symbols of wealth. They were integral to the identity of cultures that longed to understand the world beyond their borders. The ancient civilizations of the Silk Road were not isolated, but in constant conversation with one another, and the exchange of goods, like perfume and spices, was the physical manifestation of these conversations. These goods carried ideas about health, about religion, about the natural world, and helped create a shared understanding among cultures that had never met. Historians still argue whether the lasting legacy of the Silk Road was in the exchange of these tangible goods, or in the deeper cultural and intellectual exchange they fostered. On one hand, the economic impact was profound. The wealth generated from the spice trade fueled empires, transformed cities, and influenced the development of global trade. On the other hand, the cultural exchange was just as significant. The movement of perfume, spices, and other commodities was inextricably tied to the movement of people, ideas, and religions. Through the Silk Road, Buddhism spread from India to China, Christianity made its way into Central Asia, and Islamic philosophy reached the farthest reaches of the Mediterranean. The exchange of perfume and spices wasn't just a matter of trading goods. It was about the flow of knowledge, ideas, and innovations that helped shape the course of world history. Think about the impact of spices on global cuisine today. While they began their journey as rare treasures traded along the Silk Road, they are now the heart of kitchens around the world. Pepper, once so valuable it was used as currency, now enhances the flavour of almost every dish on Earth. Cinnamon, saffron, and turmeric have found their way into cuisines from India to Europe, creating an interconnected global food culture. And perfume, which once symbolized royalty and divine favor, has transformed into a multi-billion-dollar industry, one that influences fashion, culture, and personal identity on a global scale. Historians argue whether the Silk Road trade ultimately benefited the cultures along its path equally. Some suggest that the regions controlling the most strategic trade routes gained disproportionately, while others believe the overall exchange was one of mutual benefit, leading to a more globalized world. What is clear is that perfume and spices were central to these exchanges. The flow of these goods symbolized the movement of cultures and ideas. What began as a simple exchange of goods eventually led to the exchange of technologies, philosophies, and religious beliefs. The world, once divided by vast distances, began to knit itself together through trade. Even today, as we look at global trade, we see echoes of the Silk Road in the way goods, ideas, and culture continue to flow across borders. Perfume and spices might not hold the same symbolic power they once did, but they serve as reminders of the power of trade, both in the material and intangible sense. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route, it was the first step toward the globalized world we live in, where ideas and goods travel freely, connecting people from all walks of life. And in many ways, the legacy of the Silk Road, symbolized by these seemingly humble goods, continues to shape our lives every day. Looking back at the stories of ancient merchants who trekked across deserts and mountains with vials of perfume and sacks of spices, it becomes clear that their journeys were far more than simple exchanges of goods. They were participants in a grand narrative of human connection, one that transcended time and geography. The simple act of trading perfume or spices was part of a greater movement, one that helped shape civilizations, build empires, and lay the foundation for the interconnected world we know today. Historians will continue to debate the true significance of the Silk Road for years to come, but the evidence is clear. The trade of perfume and spices was essential to the world's first great network of exchange. They were the building blocks of a new global system, one that linked cultures, fostered innovation, and created lasting relationships between distant peoples. In the centuries that followed, the legacy of the Silk Road lived on in the exploration of new lands, the creation of new trade routes, and the ongoing exchange of goods, ideas, and philosophies. The world may have changed dramatically since the heyday of the Silk Road, but the legacy of perfume and spices and the connections they created remains. Every time you breathe in the fragrance of a favourite perfume or savour a dish spiced with cinnamon, you're participating in the enduring story of the Silk Road. The journey that began thousands of years ago continues to shape the way we live today. As we draw closer to the end of our journey, it's clear that the influence of perfume and spices isn't something confined to the pages of history. These goods, though traded in ancient times, still resonate in the modern world, shaping everything from global economies to our daily routines. The Silk Road, which at one point seemed like an ancient network that no longer had relevance, has left a legacy that persists, though transformed, into the present. The flow of these luxury goods, once symbols of power, wealth, and status, has shaped everything from global trade to the very essence of cultural interaction. We've seen how perfume, once a symbol of divinity and royalty, transcended time to become a part of everyday life, whether in the form of a delicate scent or a simple bottle of cologne. But its deeper symbolism is much more than just a pleasant fragrance. In the context of the Silk Road, perfume was a link to the divine, to spiritual purity and to high status. It's no surprise that throughout history, rulers and empires have used scent as a tool to assert their power and influence. The perfumes traded across the Silk Road were not just physical objects, they carried with them the cultural significance of the lands they came from. From the incense burned in Buddhist temples to the oils used in Persian royal courts, perfume was a tool of both beauty and diplomacy. The same can be said for spices. The trade of spices was revolutionary. The desire for exotic flavours pushed empires to expand, not just for conquest, but to control the precious goods that could shift the balance of power. Pepper was so valuable that it could be traded for gold, and the pursuit of spices led to the establishment of powerful maritime routes that would eventually stretch across the oceans. The very act of trading spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper reshaped global trade patterns, influencing the creation of new cities, the rise of maritime empires, and the establishment of colonial territories. The pursuit of flavour became much more than a culinary delight. It was a way to carve out dominance in a world driven by the pursuit of wealth. Historians still argue about the full scope of the economic impact that the spice trade had on the global system. Was it the driving force behind European exploration, or was it merely a contributing factor? Regardless of how it's viewed, the reality is that spice trade fundamentally altered the course of history. The goods that were once only accessible to the elite slowly trickled down to become a part of everyday life for many, democratizing once exclusive flavors and medicinal practices. But it's not just about the economic or cultural significance of these goods. Perfume and spices were also integral to the way societies understood health, wellness, and the human experience. The medicinal use of spices, for example, didn't just start as a matter of flavor, it was about survival. The preservation of food, the ability to cure ailments, and the strengthening of the immune system were directly tied to the spices traded along these routes. Cloves were believed to prevent infection, ginger was used to treat digestive issues, and cinnamon was thought to improve circulation. These early practices laid the groundwork for the world of modern medicine and continue to influence health practices today. Perfume too had its medicinal uses. In ancient Egypt, for instance, myrrh and frankincense were used to treat wounds and preserve bodies in the afterlife. These aromatic resins weren't just incense for worship, they were healing tools used in medicine to purify the air and protect against disease. In a world where medicine was often based on what was available in the environment, these perfumes and spices became part of the natural remedy arsenal. They symbolized a world where the line between luxury and utility was blurred, and where perfume, for example, was both a divine offering and a practical remedy. As we travel back to our present day, we see that perfume and spices still influence not only our health and well-being, but the way we understand luxury and culture. The global trade in these commodities has in many ways defined entire industries. Today, perfume is a multi-billion-dollar industry, with its roots firmly planted in the ancient world. Spices continue to define the flavors of our global cuisine, shaping the way we eat and interact with food. The ancient trade that once brought cinnamon from Sri Lanka and roses from Persia is now a global network of goods that brings the world closer together, connecting distant lands, cultures, and people. Historians still debate how the Silk Road's influence spread, whether through economic transactions or cultural exchanges. The impact of perfume and spices likely stems from both. The goods themselves were central to trade, but the movement of ideas, knowledge, and religion was equally significant. The Silk Road was, after all, much more than just a route for the exchange of material goods. It was a conduit for human connection and the flow of innovation. Perfume and spices were the vehicles of that connection, their trade fostering a global understanding that would eventually lead to the creation of the world as we know it today. Looking back on the journey of these goods, we realize that they have done far more than enrich people's lives with their scent and flavor. They have helped create an interconnected world, a world where people from different cultures and backgrounds can trade, learn, and grow together. The simple act of trading perfume and spices is a powerful metaphor for the exchange that continues to shape our global society. The Silk Road may no longer be a physical route, but the legacy it left behind is very much alive in the way we live today. In conclusion, the journey we've followed, through the rise of perfume and spices, their transformation from luxury goods to global staples, and their role in cultural and diplomatic exchange, shows us the enduring impact of the Silk Road. It was not just a path for trade, it was the lifeblood of global interaction, where goods like perfume and spices were exchanged. But more importantly, where cultures met, ideas flourished, and the world began to shrink. And as we continue to trade, to interact, and to share goods across borders, we are reminded of the long history that connects us all. The perfume and spices we carry today still carry the legacy of the Silk Road, reminding us of the enduring power of human connection. As we come to the final chapters of this story, we begin to see that the influence of the Silk Road, while largely tied to ancient times, continues to echo through the ages. The perfume and spices that once crossed the deserts and mountains, exchanged between distant civilizations, were not mere commodities. They were symbols of a deeper, more profound connection between peoples, cultures, and ideas. The journey of these goods is the journey of human progress itself, of exploration, of trade, of the quest to understand one another and the world. Even as time has moved on, and the once vital trade routes have become a thing of history, the legacy of the Silk Road lives on. Its most enduring impact was not just the wealth it generated or the goods it brought to distant lands, but the way it helped foster global exchange and interaction. This is where the true power of perfume and spices lies. They were the tools that brought people together, connecting empires, cultures, and continents, all in the name of trade, diplomacy, and mutual understanding. In our modern world, it's easy to overlook the origins of the goods we take for granted. We don't often think about the centuries-old history behind the spice we sprinkle into our food or the perfume we wear. Yet, every time we encounter these commodities, we are unknowingly participating in a global system that has its roots in the ancient exchanges of the Silk Road. The flow of goods, ideas, and cultures across these routes continues to shape the world we live in. Whether we're enjoying a meal seasoned with cinnamon or breathing in the aroma of a floral perfume, we're still part of the same vast network of exchange that began long ago. Historians still argue about how the world should view the legacy of the Silk Road. Is it the economic wealth it generated that stands out? Or is it the cultural exchanges that left the most significant mark? The answer, of course, is that both are equally important. The Silk Road was as much about the movement of ideas and culture as it was about the movement of goods. And at the heart of that exchange were commodities like perfume and spices, simple yet powerful agents of connection and transformation. When we reflect on the lasting legacy of the Silk Road, it's important to consider the ripple effects of this ancient trade network. Perfume and spices may seem like small details in the grand story of human history, but in reality, they represent the ways in which people have always sought to connect with one another. The simple act of sharing a gift of perfume, or the exchange of a handful of peppercorns, symbolized a desire to reach across boundaries, to connect, to build relationships, and to understand the world in a more interconnected way. The impact of perfume and spices also goes beyond cultural and economic exchange. These goods were used in healing and medicine, providing not only comfort but also essential knowledge that spread throughout the world. The practice of using spices in medicine, for example, wasn't just confined to one culture or civilization. The medicinal properties of cinnamon, ginger, and turmeric, to name a few, were known and utilized across many different regions, and their spread along the Silk Road helped to shape early medical practices across the globe. Even today, as we face new global challenges, whether in health, culture, or politics, the lessons of the Silk Road remain relevant. The idea that diverse peoples can come together, trade goods and ideas, and learn from one another is at the heart of solving some of the world's most pressing problems. The Silk Road showed us that by working together, through the exchange of knowledge and goods, we can create a more interconnected, more harmonious world. As we reflect on our journey through history, from the ancient desert routes to the bustling marketplaces of the Silk Road cities, we realize that perfume and spices were more than just trade goods. They were symbols of human connection, of the ability to transcend borders and forge relationships across vast distances. They represented the best of what humanity can achieve when we come together, exchange and collaborate for the common good. Historians still debate whether the Silk Road's true significance lies in its economic power, its cultural impact, or its intellectual influence. Perhaps the most fitting answer is that it is all of these things combined. The Silk Road was not just a trade route, it was a conduit for human exchange, a vital thread in the tapestry of global history. The perfume and spices that travelled along it weren't just markers of wealth, they were symbols of the potential for connection, understanding, and shared progress. As we conclude our journey along the Silk Road, we see that the flow of perfume and spices, though largely a thing of the past, continues to shape the world today. These goods weren't just symbols of luxury, they were catalysts for change, agents of cultural transformation, and markers of a world that was, even thousands of years ago, becoming increasingly interconnected. The Silk Road may be gone, but its legacy lives on in every exchange we make, in every relationship we build, and in every product we share across borders. The story of the Silk Road and of the perfume and spices that crossed it reminds us that the world is, and always has been, connected. The pursuit of trade, the search for new knowledge, and the desire to understand one another are timeless, and the legacy of the Silk Road proves that together we can build a more connected, more understanding world for generations to come. As we reach the final leg of our journey along the Silk Road, it becomes clear that what began as a series of trade routes spanning continents has transformed into something far greater than just a network of commerce. The exchange of perfume and spices was not merely a means of accumulating wealth, it was the beginning of a new global connectivity, one that would lay the foundation for modern international trade, cultural exchange, and the sharing of ideas. It's easy to overlook the significance of the humble perfume bottle or the tiny peppercorn in the grand scheme of history. Yet, these seemingly small items were the very catalysts that spurred monumental change. Through their trade, the Silk Road helped to spread not only material wealth, but cultural, philosophical, and scientific knowledge. The perfumes carried from Persia to Rome weren't just about fragrance, they were emblems of diplomacy and power. The spices traded from India to the Mediterranean were more than just culinary delights. They were the foundation of medical practices and systems of healing that would evolve into modern-day pharmacology. Historians will continue to debate the full extent of the impact the Silk Road had on global development. Was it primarily about the exchange of material goods, or was it the intellectual, cultural, and spiritual exchanges that defined the network's lasting legacy? What is indisputable, however, is the role perfume and spices played as vehicles of this exchange. They weren't just luxuries. They were the bridges that connected the ancient world in ways that were revolutionary for their time. Even today, we see echoes of the Silk Road in the global systems that govern our world. Perfume and spices may no longer be the currencies of power they once were, but they remain integral to the global market. The perfume industry, which traces its roots directly to the ancient trade of fragrant oils and resins, continues to thrive, influencing everything from fashion to personal identity. Spices, which once fueled exploration and empire building, are now part of daily life for billions of people, influencing cooking, health, and culture worldwide. As we reflect on the journey we've undertaken across deserts, over mountains, and through ancient cities, it becomes clear that the Silk Road was more than just a route of trade. It was a space where civilizations came together, shared their knowledge, their goods, and their stories, and in doing so, helped to shape the modern world. The perfume and spices that passed along this route may have been traded for their intrinsic value, but they also carried with them the hopes, dreams, and innovations of the people who produced them. The lasting impact of the Silk Road is evident in the way we live today. The interconnectedness that the trade routes fostered continues to influence our globalized world. Whether we're enjoying the benefits of trade, experiencing cultural diversity, or benefiting from the technological and scientific advancements passed along these routes, we are part of a legacy that began with the exchange of goods as simple and profound as perfume and spices. Historians may continue to debate the precise reasons the Silk Road flourished, and whether its true significance lies in the economic, cultural, or intellectual exchanges that took place. Perhaps it was a combination of all these factors, but what is clear is that perfume and spices were the catalyst that brought different peoples, cultures, and philosophies together. They were not just trade goods, they were symbols of a greater unity, a bridge between the East and the West, connecting people across vast distances. The Silk Road may have ceased to be a physical trade route, but its legacy lives on in the way we understand and interact with the world. The trade of perfume, spices, and other goods helped create a global system where ideas and cultures were exchanged freely, and where the influence of one civilization could be felt across the world. The movement of these goods was much more than commerce. It was a form of communication, a shared language of human connection that transcended borders and empires. As you reflect on the journey of perfume and spices along the Silk Road, take a moment to appreciate the ongoing significance of what began so long ago. These ancient routes, though no longer in use, helped lay the groundwork for the modern world, one where goods, ideas, and cultures continue to flow freely, connecting us in ways that would have been unimaginable to the merchants and travellers of the past. The story of perfume and spices is a story of connection, of humanity's quest to reach across vast distances and build a more interconnected, more harmonious world. It is a reminder that even the smallest exchanges, whether they be in the form of goods, ideas, or stories, can change the course of history. And as we continue to exchange goods, share knowledge, and build bridges across cultures, we are all part of the same ongoing journey that began on the ancient Silk Road. Ancient Silk Road, 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 ancient Silk Road.